If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter, learnt of friends and gentleness, and hearts at peace under an English heaven.
In the immediate aftermath of a harrowing battle during World War II, S.L.A. Marshall, a U.S. Army historian and combat analyst, gathered small groups of soldiers for a debriefing. The air was thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder and the raw tension of men who had just faced death. Marshall, armed with nothing more than a notebook and a sharp mind, began to ask the soldiers about their experiences in the fight. He expected to hear stories of valor and lethal efficiency, soldiers who had faced the enemy and discharged their weapons with deadly precision. But as the men recounted their actions, Marshall was struck by a disturbing revelation. The majority of these soldiers, far from the lethal warriors of popular imagination, had not fired their weapons at all. In fact, only 15 to 25% did fire. This statistic was shocking to military leaders, who had assumed that soldiers, trained and equipped, would naturally shoot to kill when facing the enemy. Marshall's methodology involved post-combat interviews, where he would debrief soldiers in small groups, often within hours or days after a battle. He would ask each soldier about their actions during the engagement, aiming to piece together a comprehensive picture of what happened on the battlefield. His goal was to understand not just the physical actions of the soldiers, but their psychological states, why they did what they did or did not do. He found that most combat soldiers did not fire their weapons, even when directly engaged with the enemy. This was not due to a lack of opportunity or equipment failure. The soldiers had functioning weapons and ammunition, and were often in situations where firing was expected. Instead, the reluctance to fire was attributed to a deeper psychological resistance to killing another human being. Marshall's conclusion? That only 15 to 25% of soldiers actually fired at the enemy, challenged the prevailing belief that soldiers, once trained and placed in combat, would instinctively fight. This discovery suggested that even in the heat of battle, where survival might depend on returning fire, most soldiers were unwilling or unable to do so. Marshall's findings had profound implications. If the majority of soldiers were not firing, it meant that traditional models of military training and combat effectiveness were flawed. The assumption that soldiers would naturally kill if their lives depended on it was called into question. This had ramifications for how armies trained their soldiers, planned their battles, and understood the nature of combat itself. Marshall's study also opened up new avenues of inquiry into the psychological toll of combat. Why did so many soldiers refuse to fire? Was it fear, moral reluctance, or something else entirely? The study suggested that the reluctance to kill was not just about taking life. It was about the act of engaging with the enemy at all. Many soldiers, it seemed, were psychologically paralyzed in the face of combat, unable to bring themselves to fire their weapons, even in the general direction of the enemy. Marshall's work has not been without its critics. Some have questioned his methodology, arguing that his reliance on group interviews might have led to inaccuracies or exaggerations. Others have suggested that his findings were influenced by his own preconceptions about combat. Despite these criticisms, however, subsequent studies have largely supported the idea that a significant percentage of soldiers in combat do not fire their weapons, and even if they do not shoot to kill. One of the most telling indicators of this psychological barrier is the ratio of shots fired to confirmed hits. In modern conflicts, this ratio can be staggeringly high and tend to bear out Marshall's findings. During the Vietnam War, it was estimated that US soldiers fired approximately 50,000 rounds for every enemy combatant killed. In more recent conflicts, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan, this number has varied, but remains high, often in the thousands of rounds per confirmed kill. So now to the obvious question: why? Why would highly trained soldiers, those trained for months or longer to shoot to kill, not shoot to kill? Take a moment to consider the psychological and emotional barriers that soldiers face in combat. Killing, even in war, goes against one of the most deeply ingrained human instincts: the aversion to taking another life. This is not just a cultural or moral issue, but a biological one. Humans are social creatures, and violence, particularly lethal violence, is a violation of the social contract that underpins our species' survival. Military training attempts to override this instinct through rigorous drills, conditioning, and desensitization. Soldiers are trained to see the enemy as a threat rather than a fellow human, and this dehumanization is crucial to overcoming the natural aversion to killing. However, this conditioning is not foolproof. In the heat of battle, when the abstraction of training meets the reality of a living, breathing target, the human element often reasserts itself. Soldiers may hesitate, aim high, or even deliberately miss, subconsciously avoiding the act of killing. Several factors contribute to this contradiction. First, the fog of war. The chaos and confusion of battle can make accurate shooting difficult. Soldiers may fire suppressive or covering fire, intended not to kill, but to keep the enemy at bay. Additionally, the psychological stress of combat can impair a soldier's aim, leading to more missed shots. Underlying these tactical considerations is the fundamental human reluctance to kill. Even with advances in weaponry, targeting systems, and training, the psychological hurdle remains. The high number of rounds fired, versus confirmed hits can be seen as a manifestation of this internal conflict, a tension between the soldiers' training and their innate human instincts. This reluctance to kill, evident even with long-distance lethal projectile weapons, raises intriguing questions about combat in earlier eras, where killing was often up close and personal. In ancient warfare, such as that practiced by Roman legionnaires, combatants were not separated by hundreds of yards, but by mere feet. The glint of a sword, the sound of labored breathing, and the sight of an enemy's eyes filled with fear or rage were immediate and unavoidable. One might assume that such proximity would either amplify the human reluctance to kill or harden soldiers into relentless killing machines. But what does history tell us? In ancient Rome, the legionary was trained rigorously to fight in tight formations using short swords or gladii designed for stabbing rather than slashing. The nature of this weapon and the formations in which legionnaires fought, shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, created an environment where killing was both a collective and individual act. The training emphasized discipline, unit cohesion, and the mechanical execution of killing moves, much like modern reflexive fire training. Yet even in this context, there is evidence to suggest that the reluctance to kill was still present. Accounts of ancient battles often emphasize the psychological aspects of warfare, the noise, the intimidation, and the attempt to break the enemy's will, rather than slaughter them outright. The famous testudo formation, where soldiers interlocked their shields to create a near-impenetrable barrier, was as much about advancing safely and creating psychological pressure on the enemy as it was about protecting the soldiers. Roman military strategy often focused on breaking the enemy's morale, leading to routs or surrenders, rather than engaging in wholesale slaughter. The reluctance to kill in antiquity was likely influenced by the same basic human instincts that persist today. Even in the chaotic, brutal world of ancient combat, the goal was often to force the enemy off the field, rather than to wipe them out entirely. This was not just a matter of pragmatism. Killing an enemy in close combat required a level of personal commitment that many soldiers found difficult to summon. The Roman soldier, like his modern counterpart, was trained to kill, but the act itself was still a profound psychological hurdle. The close-quarters nature of ancient combat meant that soldiers were often more aware of the humanity of their opponents. They could see the fear or determination in their enemies' eyes, hear their shouts and cries, and feel the resistance of flesh and bone. This intimacy might have made killing even more difficult, reinforcing the idea that many soldiers in history, when given the choice, might have preferred to intimidate or frighten their enemies into submission, rather than kill them outright. In response to Marshall's findings and subsequent studies, military training has evolved over the years. One significant change has been the introduction of realistic combat simulations that aim to replicate the stress and chaos of an actual battle. These simulations are designed to condition soldiers to respond instinctively, reducing hesitation and increasing the likelihood of firing to kill. Another key development has been the use of reflexive fire training, where soldiers practice shooting at targets that appear unexpectedly, mimicking the sudden appearance of an enemy in combat. This training aims to make shooting a reflexive action, bypassing the conscious decision-making process that can lead to hesitation. Despite these advancements, the human factor remains. The reluctance to kill is deeply rooted, and while training can mitigate it, it cannot eliminate it entirely. This is not necessarily a flaw, but a reflection of the complex nature of human morality and psychology. Soldiers, after all, are not machines. They are individuals with their own beliefs, values, and instincts. Statistics on combat, how many soldiers pulled the trigger at all, how many shot to kill, and the ratio of rounds fired to confirmed hits, have never escaped criticism or dispute. Accounts from World War II through Vietnam and into Iraq and Afghanistan vary widely. At times, officials may understate the data to reassure the public that the military is more efficient and lethal than it is. At other times, critics may pad the numbers to underscore the waste and futility of combat. And as previously mentioned, the staggering ratios, thousands of bullets for each downed target, often serve solely to keep the enemy pinned down. Yet, whatever motive drives those sums, or wherever the true average lies, the essential fact remains. Many soldiers do not pull the trigger with the intent to take a life. And that restraint is not the mark of cowardice. On the contrary, the act of simply holding one's ground, facing the nightmare of battle while keeping a weapon ready but unfired, is valor in itself. Any claim that war has always been avoidable is a bold, almost untenable position. To insist that uncompromising pacifism should have let tyranny and fascism march forward unopposed. The Second World War offers the clearest example. A conflict fought, whatever the cost, because the alternative was unthinkable. In such moments, courage demanded itself on every front. Commanders decide when wars begin, but ordinary soldiers carry the weight of those decisions. Each trigger pull reckoning not just with survival, but with morality. If there is heroism to be found, it lies not only in the shot that finds its mark, but in the hesitation before it leaves the barrel. The stubborn insistence on remembering that the figure in the crosshairs is, whatever else, another human. Restraint is a virtue in its own right, and one that complicates our picture of battle. These statistics, then, do not reveal who felt fear or lacked will, but how deeply rooted our aversion to killing remains. And how remarkable it is that, even in the crucible of warfare, the human conscience persists. History shows us that this paradox is not new. Whether wielding a gladius or an M16, soldiers have faced the same fundamental challenge: overcoming the almost uniformly innate human aversion to taking another life. This challenge has shaped the tactics, training, and psychological strategies of armies across the ages, from the disciplined ranks of Roman legionnaires to the high-tech forces of today. As military training continues to evolve, it will need to grapple with this paradox, balancing the need for combat effectiveness with an understanding of the human condition. For as long as there are soldiers, there will be the dilemma of the trigger, a decision that, for many, will never be as straightforward as it might seem. That said, there is another perspective that lies entirely outside of the effort consistently dedicated to making soldiers more likely to shoot to kill: the avoidance of war altogether. But until that happy day arrives, however unlikely, perhaps it's best to take heart in the fact that when a trigger is pulled, it's just as likely as not, roughly speaking, that nothing will die.